My rich grandpa smiled. How do you spend your $3,400,000 trust fund? I blinked. What trust fund? My name is Mary Hart. I'm 27 years old. It happened on my 27th birthday. The restaurant glittered with glass chandeliers, perfume, and laughter that didn't belong to me. My family's kind of rich, the kind that hides secrets behind smiles. My grandfather lifted his glass and said, "Mary, how do you spend your $3.4 million trust fund?" The laughter died. Forks froze midair. My mother's face went white. My father's hand twitched, and I blinked. What trust fund? The air turned heavy. My grandpa's voice dropped an octave. The one I created for you when you were born. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner wasn't a birthday celebration. It was an execution, and my parents were about to be exposed. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. My name is Mary Hart. For 27 years, I grew up believing that my parents' silence was a form of love. I thought their distance was meant to build my character, to make me strong. I now know that it was just practice for abandoning me. My parents, James and Victoria Hart, lived in a house that was more like a modern art museum. It was a glass and steel mansion tucked away in Marin County, a place where the driveways are long and the secrets are longer. From their infinity pool, you could see the faint outline of the San Francisco skyline, a city they visited for expensive dinners but never to see me. Their life was a curated collection of luxuries. They had matching Teslas in the garage, a wine cellar stocked with bottles I couldn't pronounce, and a social calendar filled with charity galas and weekend trips to Napa. Their smiles were as polished as the marble on their kitchen island. My life was a different story. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment in the city with a roommate, Madison. The paint on our walls was peeling in long, sad strips, and the plumbing made a groaning noise every time our upstairs neighbor flushed the toilet. While my parents drove their Teslas, I took the bus. While they drank vintage wine, I drank tap water. My prized possession was a second-hand laptop that overheated if I had more than 3 tabs open at once. It was on that flickering screen that I built my life, one freelance graphic design project at a time. I had student loans. The email notification from Sally Mae was a monthly punch to the gut, a constant reminder of the debt I carried while my parents discussed which European river cruise to take next. I never asked them for help with it. I never asked them for help with anything, not after what happened when I was in college. I was a sophomore, and a required textbook for a history class cost over $300. It was more money than I had in my bank account. I called my mother, my voice small and full of shame. I hated asking. I explained the situation, expecting her to say, "Of course, honey, I'll transfer the money." Instead, there was a long, cold pause on the other end of the line. "Mary," she finally said, her voice dripping with disappointment, "we are not raising a daughter who depends on handouts. Your father and I worked for everything we have. You need to learn the value of $1. Get a job at the library. Be resourceful." I hung up the phone, my face burning. I ended up buying an older, outdated edition of the book for $20 and spent the rest of the semester trying to catch up, constantly borrowing notes from classmates. I got a B in that class. It was the only B on my transcript, a permanent mark of my failure to be resourceful. My parents never asked about it again. When I graduated from college, with honors, despite everything, they came to the ceremony. My father shook my hand firmly, like he was closing a business deal. My mother gave me a book with a stiff, glossy cover. It was called Financial Literacy for Young Adults. "We are so proud of you for making it on your own," my father said, patting my shoulder. "This will help you on your journey." There was no check tucked inside, no offer to help me with a deposit on an apartment, just a lecture about the importance of self-sufficiency as we stood on the university lawn, surrounded by other graduates, whose parents were popping champagne and handing them keys to new cars. I smiled, thanked them, and swallowed the lump in my throat. I had learned my lesson. Asking for help was a sign of weakness. Wanting anything from them was a character flaw. So I worked. I worked late nights, weekends, and holidays. I took on tiny, soul-crushing design jobs for companies that paid late and demanded endless revisions. I ate instant noodles and learned to patch my own clothes. I told myself I was building character, just like they wanted. I saved every penny I could, slowly building a small emergency fund that felt like a mountain of gold to me, even though it wouldn't have covered one of my mother's shopping trips to Chanel. My parents called once a month. The calls were always the same. They would spend 10 minutes detailing their latest vacation, a new restaurant they tried, or a ridiculously expensive piece of art they bought for the entryway. They never asked about my work. They never asked if I was happy. They never asked if I was okay. The one time I tried to tell them about a project I was proud of, my mother cut me off. "That's nice, dear," she said, her voice distant. "Oh, that reminds me. Your father and I are thinking of going to Bali next month. Do you think we should?" I was just a box they had to check. Daughter called. I stopped trying to tell them about my life. I just listened, made the right noises of encouragement, and then hung up and stared at the peeling paint in my apartment. I told myself this was normal. This was how wealthy, busy people showed their love. They were teaching me to be independent. They were proud of me from a distance. I still tried to impress them. I sent them links to my online portfolio, hoping for a word of praise. I would get a one-line email back from my father's assistant a week later. "Mr. Hart has received your email and sends his regards." It was like throwing pebbles at a brick wall. I never imagined the real reason for their calm, their distance, their constant lectures about self-reliance. It wasn't about building my character. It wasn't about teaching me the value of $1. It was about covering their tracks. They needed me to believe I had nothing, so I would never ask about the fortune they were stealing from me. Their pride wasn't in my independence. It was in their deception. It was theft, disguised as a life lesson. The invitation came a week after I lost my job. It wasn't a dramatic firing. It was the quiet, sterile kind of job loss that feels even more insulting. The small marketing firm I worked for was restructuring. My position, they said, was being eliminated. I was given 2 weeks severance and a cardboard box for the things on my desk. I spent the next few days in a fog, updating my resume and scrolling through job postings that all seemed to want 10 years of experience for an entry-level salary. The dread was a physical weight in my chest. My emergency fund, which I had been so proud of, now looked terrifyingly small. That's when my mother called. Her voice was unusually bright, a sharp contrast to the gray anxiety that had settled over my life. "Mary, darling, your birthday is next week. We're taking you out to celebrate," she announced. It wasn't a question. "Oh, Mom, I don't know. It's not a great time," I mumbled, staring at a rejection email that had just popped into my inbox. "Nonsense. We've already booked a table at Atelier Cren, Saturday at 8. Dress nicely," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It's your big night. Atelier Cren." I had to Google it. The restaurant was a legend in San Francisco, Francisco, famous for its tasting menu that cost more than my monthly rent. A place for tech billionaires and old money families. It was their world, not mine. The thought of going made me feel exhausted. I wanted to stay home in my worn-out sweatpants and eat takeout with Madison, but saying no would have caused a fight I didn't have the energy for. So I agreed. When Saturday night came, I stood in front of my small closet, feeling like a fraud. I finally settled on a simple black dress I'd bought on sale years ago. It was the only thing I owned that didn't look like it belonged to a struggling artist. As I rode the bus downtown, I watched the city lights blur past, feeling a familiar knot of inadequacy tighten in my stomach. When I walked into Atelier Cren, the air itself felt expensive. It smelled of perfume, fresh oysters, and money. A soft, golden light glowed from crystal chandeliers, and the low hum of conversation was punctuated by the gentle clinking of glasses. My father and mother were already at a corner table, looking perfectly at home. My father was in a tailored suit, my mother in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. "There you are," my mother said, offering me her cheek for an air kiss. She pulled back and studied my face, her brow furrowed in disapproval. "You look tired." The comment landed like a small, sharp stone. "I lost my job this week," I said quietly, hoping for a sliver of sympathy. She waved her hand dismissively, as if shooing away a fly. "Oh, you'll bounce back. You always do. Now, let's not talk about unpleasant things." She was already scrolling through the wine list on her phone, her attention gone. My father just gave me a curt nod, his eyes scanning the room, probably looking for someone more important to acknowledge. I should have left right then. I should have turned around, walked out the door, and gone back to my real life. But I didn't. I slid into the plush chair, feeling small and out of place, a ghost at their feast. We made small talk. They talked about their friends, their investments, their upcoming trip. I listened, offered nothing, and felt myself disappearing. Then the energy at the table shifted. My mother's back went rigid. I followed her gaze and saw a tall, older man walking toward our table. He had a full head of thick silver hair and wore a dark, perfectly fitted suit. His eyes were a sharp, intelligent blue, and they missed nothing. It was my grandfather, Robert Sterling, my mother's father. "Dad," my mother said, her voice tight and strained. The smile she put on was brittle, like a piece of glass about to shatter. "What a surprise. You didn't have to come." "Oh, but I did," my grandfather said, his voice a calm, deep rumble that cut through the restaurant's noise. He ignored my parents and his eyes settled on me, a genuine warmth spreading across his face. I wouldn't miss my granddaughter's 27th birthday for the world. He pulled a chair up and sat beside me. He smelled faintly of whiskey and cedar. My parents exchanged a panicked look. I hadn't seen my grandfather in over a year. He and my mother had a strained relationship. A cold war of polite phone calls and missed holidays. He'd always been kind to me, but he was a peripheral figure, someone I only saw on rare occasions. His presence here felt significant, like a storm cloud moving over a calm sea. He ordered a whiskey, neat, and then turned his full attention to me. He asked about my apartment. He asked about Madison. He asked about my design work. And when I told him I'd been laid off, his expression hardened with real concern. "That's a tough break, Mary, but you're talented. You'll land on your feet," he said. And unlike when my mother said it, I actually believed him. For a few minutes, it felt like a real birthday dinner. My grandfather made me feel seen. My parents, however, were silent and tense, watching him like he was a bomb that was about to go off. And then, he lit the fuse. He took a sip of his whiskey, set the glass down with a soft click, and looked at me with that same warm smile. The trap was set. The air grew still. Then came the question that detonated our entire lives. "So, Mary," he said, his voice perfectly casual, "tell me, how have you been spending your $3.4 million trust fund?" The silence that followed my grandfather's question was absolute. It was heavier than any sound. The cheerful noise of the restaurant, the clinking of silverware, the soft music, it all faded away into a distant hum. All I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart against my ribs. My parents were frozen, their faces masks of sheer panic. "What trust fund?" I asked again, my voice barely a whisper. I looked from my grandfather's steady, serious face to my mother, who was now staring at her water glass as if it held the answers to the universe. My grandfather didn't take his eyes off my parents. "The trust I set up when Mary was born, Victoria," he said, his voice dangerously calm. He spoke to her, but his words were for me. "I funded it with an initial investment and added to it every year on her birthday. The terms were very clear. The assets were to be managed by you and James until she turned 25, at which point control would transfer entirely to her." That was 2 years ago. My mother let out a laugh. It was a terrible sound. Too loud, too high, and sharp with desperation. It made heads turn at nearby tables. "Dad, you must be mistaken," she said, trying to wave it away. "Your memory? It was a small college fund. We used it for her tuition, of course." I frowned. That wasn't true. I'd paid for my tuition with scholarships and a mountain of student loans. I opened my mouth to say so, but my grandfather spoke first. "Victoria," he said, and the single word was filled with so much steel that she flinched. "Don't." He gave a slight nod. A woman who had been sitting alone at a nearby table stood up and walked over. She was sharply dressed in a business suit and held a slim leather folder. She placed it on the table in front of my grandfather with a soft thud. I recognized her as Michelle, his longtime assistant. She was always with him, a quiet, efficient shadow. "The account statements," she said, her voice neutral. My grandfather slid the folder across the polished wood table toward me. My hand trembled as I opened it. The top page was a summary statement from a private bank I'd never heard of. The account was titled, "The Mary Hart Irrevocable Trust," and at the bottom of the page, in bold black letters, was the current balance, $203.47.19. The number didn't make sense. It was a huge amount of money, more than I had ever seen in my life, but my grandfather had said, "It should be $3.4 million," I said, looking up from the paper. The words felt strange in my mouth. My heart was hammering, a frantic, painful rhythm in my chest. "Where's the rest?" My father finally spoke, his voice thick and rough. "It's complicated, Mary. The market investments go up and down?" It wasn't a sure thing. The portfolio was 90% treasury bonds and blue-chip stocks, James, my grandfather countered, his voice like ice. "It was designed to be stable. It wasn't designed for you to play with." My mother's composure finally cracked. "We used some of it," she whispered, her eyes darting between me and her father. "We had to, for family needs. We were always going to pay it back. $3 million worth of needs?" My grandfather's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of an accusation. He nodded at Michelle again. She reached into the folder and pulled out another set of papers, a detailed list of withdrawals. February 12th, 2019, Michelle began to read, her voice clear and dispassionate. Withdrawal of $450,000, purpose listed, mortgage payment. I remembered that. My parents had paid off their mortgage on the Marin house. My mother had bragged about it, saying my father had made a brilliant move in the stock market. June 3rd, 2020, Michelle continued. 2 withdrawals of $140,000 each. Total, $280,000. Purpose, automotive purchase. The matching Teslas. The his and hers anniversary gifts they'd paraded in front of their friends. They told me it was a reward for a successful year at my father's consulting firm. September 21st, 2021. Withdrawal of $320,000 purpose. Home renovation, the new kitchen. The one with the marble island and the imported Italian appliances. The one I had only seen in pictures on my mother's Instagram. My world was tilting on its axis. Every luxury they had celebrated, every trip they had taken, every boast they had made, it was all paid for with my money. The money I never knew I had. The money that should have paid for my education, helped me start my life, and given me the security they preached about but had stolen from me. Michelle wasn't finished. August 5th, 2022. Withdrawal of $500,000. Purpose, real estate investment. And then came the final, crushing blow, January 10th, 2024. Withdrawal of $1.8 million. Purpose, property purchase in Malibu, California. The property is registered under the names James and Victoria Hart, the Malibu house, their getaway home, the one they said was their nest egg for retirement. I stared at them, the 2 people who were supposed to protect me. Their faces were pale and drawn. They looked like strangers, like common criminals caught in the act. The pieces of my life clicked into place, forming a picture of betrayal so vast it stole the air from my lungs. The lectures on self-sufficiency, the denial of a $300 textbook, the gift of a financial literacy book at my graduation. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed narrative to keep me poor and quiet while they lived a life of luxury on my future. You stole my future, I said, the words coming out flat and empty. My mother reached a hand across the table, her fingers trembling. No, Mary, no, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. We were managing it for you, protecting it. My grandfather stood up then, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the table. His face was grim, his voice low and final. No, Victoria, he said, looking down at his daughter with a look of profound disappointment. You were robbing her. The word robbing hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My mother started to tremble, a visible tremor that ran through her entire body. My father just sat there, his face ashen, muttering something under his breath about market crashes and bad advice, the desperate, flimsy excuses of a man who had been caught. The other diners in the restaurant were now openly staring, their curiosity overriding their politeness. The scene was too dramatic to ignore. The weeping woman, the furious old man, and the pale, silent girl sitting in the middle of the wreckage. My grandfather's focus was entirely on my parents. He held out his hand, palm up. Give me the keys, he said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. My mother looked at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. What keys? She stammered. The keys to the house in Marin, the keys to the Teslas, all of it. Now, she hesitated, clutching her ridiculously expensive handbag to her chest as if it were a shield. My father shot her a look, a silent, panicked command. But my grandfather's gaze was unyielding. With a defeated sob, my mother fumbled inside her purse, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the keychains. She pulled out 2 sleek Tesla key fobs and a larger ring with the keys to the glass mansion. She slid them across the table. They made a soft, metallic whisper against the polished wood before stopping in front of me. My grandfather turned his sharp eyes to me. They're yours now, Mary, he said, his voice softening slightly. The house, the cars, every property, every asset that was bought with your money. It all belongs to you? The weight of his words was too much to comprehend. I could only stare at the keys, these symbols of a life I had only ever seen from the outside. My mother finally broke down completely. The tears she had been holding back streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. Please, Dad, don't do this, she pleaded, her voice cracking. We're family. We can fix this. Mary, please, say something. I looked at her, at this woman who gave me life and then systematically stole the one she owed me. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a vast, cold emptiness. Family doesn't steal from family. my grandfather said, his voice flat and final. He gestured for the bill, paid with a black credit card without even looking at the total, and then helped me to my feet. My legs felt unsteady, like they might buckle beneath me. As we walked away, I glanced back at the table. My parents were still sitting there, two beautifully dressed statues in a sea of glittering lights, utterly and completely alone. They didn't even look at each other. They just stared into the space we had left behind. Outside, the cool San Francisco air was a shock after the stuffy restaurant. My grandfather's driver was waiting with a black town car. As we slid into the back seat, the silence was a relief. We drove through the city, the lights of the buildings blurring into streaks of color. I clutched the keys in my fist, the metal edges digging into my palm. After several minutes, my grandfather finally spoke. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, Mary," he said, his voice heavy with regret. But there was no other way. They wouldn't have listened to reason. "Why tonight?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Why now?" He sighed, looking out the window at the passing streets. "Because they were planning to run," he said grimly. "I've had my suspicions for a while. Victoria has been avoiding my calls, and their spending was reckless, even for them. So I hired a private investigator. He found flight tickets to Costa Rica, one way for this coming Tuesday. They had already started moving the last of the money into an offshore account. The cold emptiness inside me suddenly turned to ice. They weren't just thieves. They were preparing to disappear, to leave me with nothing but my student loans and peeling apartment walls, and never look back. My voice broke. "So this dinner, this wasn't a celebration. It was a trap." He turned to look at me, his blue eyes filled with a sad resolve. "Yes," he said, and they walked right into it. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, it was almost impossible to grasp. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a long, deliberate con, perpetrated by my own parents. They had invited me to my own execution, planning to offer me a final, expensive meal before they vanished with the last of my life. But my grandfather had turned the tables. The trap had been for them. The driver pulled up outside my worn-down apartment building. It looked shabbier than ever compared to the world I had just left. My grandfather walked me to the door. "Get some rest, Mary," he said gently. "My lawyer will be in touch tomorrow. We have a lot of work to do." I nodded, unable to speak. I watched him get back into the car and disappear into the night. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. Madison was on the couch watching a movie. She took one look at my face and turned the TV off. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. I opened my hand and let the keys clatter onto our small, wobbly coffee table. "My parents," I said, my voice finally finding its strength, "have been stealing from me my entire life, and I think I just took it all back." That night, sleep was impossible. I sat on my lumpy sofa in the dark, the keys to my parents' life, my life, still clutched in my hand. The metal was warm now, molded to my grip. Outside, the city hummed its usual late-night song of sirens and distant traffic. But inside my apartment, the silence was deafening. My mind, however, was a Category 5 hurricane. It kept replaying the scene at the restaurant, a nightmare on a loop. My mother's brittle smile, my father's twitching hand, my grandfather's voice like stone saying, "You were robbing her." Madison had been amazing. After I'd stumbled through the explanation, she didn't overwhelm me with questions. She just made me a cup of tea, sat with me, and listened. Her anger was a warm, protective shield. "They're monsters, Mary," she whispered, her eyes fierce. "What they did, it's evil." Hearing her say it, seeing the pure, uncomplicated rage on her face, helped to validate the chaos swirling inside me. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was evil. I tried to untangle the years of lies. Every memory was now tainted. Every past kindness a potential manipulation. The Financial Literacy for Young Adults book wasn't a thoughtful gift. It was a sick joke. The lectures about self-sufficiency weren't meant to build my character. They were designed to keep me from asking questions. They needed me to be poor. They needed me to struggle. My struggle was the price of their comfort, the cost of their Teslas and their Malibu beach house. The deepest cut of all was the memory of that phone call in college, when I'd begged for $300 for a textbook. My mother's cold disappointment, her lecture on handouts. She'd had millions of my dollars at her fingertips then, and she had chosen to humiliate me instead. She let me feel like a failure while she was spending my inheritance on a new designer handbag. The most chilling thought, the one that kept circling back, was my grandfather's final revelation, the one-way tickets to Costa Rica. This wasn't just theft. It was the final act of abandonment. They were going to drain the last of the account and disappear, leaving me to piece together my life from the rubble. They would have sent a postcard probably. Wish you were here. P.S. We sold your future for sunshine and beachfront property. That dinner wasn't just a trap for them. It was my salvation. If my grandfather hadn't stepped in, I would have woken up on Tuesday morning to an empty bank account and an even emptier family tree. The thought made me physically sick. I ran to the bathroom and retched, my body expelling a poison that felt like it had been building up for years. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through my window, something inside me shifted. The shock and the nausea began to recede, and in their place a strange calm settled. It was a cold, hard, and clear feeling. The grief was still there, a massive, gaping wound in my chest. But the weakness was gone, the part of me that had spent a lifetime trying to earn their approval, the part that flinched at their criticism and craved their attention, had died in that restaurant. I was done crying. I was done feeling small. A quiet storm was gathering inside me, and I knew with absolute certainty that it was about to break over my parents' perfectly curated world. I picked up my phone. My hands were steady now. I scrolled to my grandfather's number and pressed call. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert and clear, as if he'd been waiting. "Mary," he said simply. "Good morning?" I said, my voice even. "I've had some time to think. I want to fix this. Legally." There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear the faint sound of a smile in his voice when he replied. "Good," he said. "That's the answer I was hoping for. Michael, my attorney, will handle everything. He's the best. He'll be in touch within the hour." True to his word, less than an hour later, I received a call from a man named Michael Vance. His voice was calm, professional, and radiated a competence that was incredibly reassuring. He didn't offer condolences or get emotional. He just got straight to the point. He explained the legal terms, misappropriation of trust funds, breach of fiduciary duty, in a way that was simple and direct. He told me the first step was to file for an immediate injunction to freeze every known asset my parents held. "Your grandfather's investigator compiled a thorough list," Michael explained. "Bank accounts, property deeds, vehicle registrations. We're going to lock it all down. They won't be able to move a single dollar." He emailed me the documents. I sat at my small, wobbly kitchen table, reading through pages of dense legal language that I barely understood. But I understood the purpose. At the bottom of each page was a line for my signature. For years, my name had been a liability to me. Now it was a weapon. I printed the papers at the local copy shop, signed each one with a firm, clear hand, scanned them, and sent them back to Michael. It felt like signing my own Declaration of Independence. The next 72 hours were a blur of legal activity. Michael was a force of nature. Subpoenas were issued to my parents and their financial institutions. Audits were ordered. The quiet storm inside me had manifested into a legal tempest, and I was at its calm, clear center. I didn't have to scream or yell or confront my parents. I just had to sign my name and let the truth do the work. By the weekend, the first results came in. Michael called me on Saturday afternoon. "The injunction was granted," he said. "The Malibu house is frozen. The Marin County property is frozen. Both Teslas have been legally repossessed and are being held in a secure facility. Their personal bank accounts are locked pending the audit. They can't touch a thing." I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me. Frozen, locked, repossessed. These weren't words of revenge. They were words of justice. It wasn't about making them suffer. It was about stopping the bleeding. It was about taking back the control they had stolen from me. That night, Madison brought home a cheap bottle of champagne. We drank it out of mismatched coffee mugs, sitting on the floor of my apartment. "To the quiet storm," she said, raising her mug. I smiled, a real smile this time. "They stole years from me, Maddie," I said, the champagne bubbles fizzing on my tongue. "And I'm done letting them. This isn't about the money anymore. It's about the truth." I didn't know what was coming next. I knew there would be a fight. I knew my parents wouldn't go down quietly. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them. The daughter who asked for too little was finally ready to demand what was rightfully hers. 3 days later, the summons came. It wasn't a court date, but a meeting. A mediation session, Michael called it, arranged by my parents' newly hired lawyer. It was to take place in a neutral location, the boardroom of my grandfather's corporate headquarters downtown. The irony was not lost on me. For my entire life, I had been kept out of that world of glass towers and silent, powerful men. Now, I was walking into its heart, not as a visitor, but as a key player. The morning of the meeting, I felt a tremor of the old anxiety. What should I wear? It seemed like a foolish question, but I knew it mattered. It wasn't about fashion. It was about armor. I couldn't show up looking like the struggling, broke artist they had cultivated me to be. I needed to look like someone they couldn't lie to anymore. I chose a simple, dark blue sheath dress I'd bought for a job interview, paired with a black blazer. It was the most powerful outfit I owned. Madison stood by the door as I was getting ready to leave. "You look like a CEO," she said, her voice full of pride. "Go in there and own them, Mary." Her belief in me was a shield. The drive to the financial district was surreal. I took a taxi, a small luxury I allowed myself, and stared out at the imposing skyscrapers. I had always found them intimidating, symbols of a world I didn't belong to. Today, I was walking into the tallest one. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and polished steel, filled with the quiet, purposeful hum of serious business. I gave my name to the security guard, and he nodded, handing me a visitor's pass without a second glance. I rode the silent, high-speed elevator to the 50th floor. The doors opened onto a serene, minimalist reception area with a panoramic view of the San Francisco Bay. My grandfather and Michael were waiting for me. Grandpa Robert gave my shoulder a firm squeeze. "You're ready for this," he said. It wasn't a question. Michael simply nodded, a file of papers tucked under his arm. We walked into the boardroom. It was a long, intimidating room, dominated by a massive mahogany table that reflected the city skyline like a dark mirror. My grandfather took the seat at the head of the table, and Michael and I sat on one side. We waited. The power dynamic had already been set. This was our territory. They were coming to us. A few minutes later, the door opened and my parents walked in, followed by a lawyer who looked slick and expensive. The change in my parents was shocking. The regal, untouchable confidence they had worn like a second skin at the restaurant was gone. Stripped of their access to my money, they looked smaller, diminished. My father's suit seemed to hang off his frame, and my mother's face was pale and strained beneath a heavy layer of makeup. Their expensive clothes now looked like costumes for a role they could no longer play. They avoided my eyes as they took their seats on the opposite side of the table. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Their lawyer cleared his throat and began, his voice smooth and practiced. "We are here today to find an amicable solution to this unfortunate family misunderstanding." Michael cut him off, not with rudeness, but with a calm, surgical precision. "This is not a misunderstanding," he said, opening his file. "This is a clear case of felony misappropriation of trust funds. Let's not waste time with euphemisms." My mother flinched. She finally looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Mary, darling, please," she began, her voice quivering. "This is all a terrible mistake. We were just trying to protect your future. The money, it was just sitting there. We invested it for you to make it grow. We were always going to give it all back to you, with interest." The lie was so audacious, so insulting to my intelligence, that it didn't even make me angry. I felt a strange, detached calm. I looked her directly in the eye. "By spending it?" I asked, my voice quiet but clear. "Was the Malibu house a long-term investment for me? Were the Teslas part of my portfolio?" Her face crumpled. My father, seeing her falter, decided to switch tactics from pleading to aggression. He slammed his hand flat on the polished table. The sound echoed in the silent room. "We gave you life," he boomed, his face turning a blotchy red. "We raised you. Everything we did was for this family. You have no idea what it costs to maintain our position, to give you the name you have. You are an ungrateful child." The words that once would have shattered me now bounced off the armor I was wearing. The ungrateful accusation was their favorite weapon, one they had used to keep me in line my entire life. But it was useless now. "You gave me life," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the glass wall behind me. "And then you sold it. You sold it piece by piece to pay for your cars and your vacations and your houses. The name you're so proud of is the name of thieves." My father's jaw dropped. He looked at me as if he'd never seen me before. He was right. He hadn't. Michael took that as his cue. He slid a document across the table toward my parents' lawyer. "This is a summary of the charges we are prepared to file with the district attorney's office," he said clinically. "Misappropriation of trust funds, multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. Given the amounts and the duration, you're looking at significant felony charges. We're talking about prison time. Serious prison time. Prison." The word hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. My mother let out a choked sob. This was no longer about money or shame. This was about iron bars and concrete walls. The reality of their situation finally crashed down on them. "Mary, no," she wept, her hands clasped in front of her as if in prayer. "You can't. We're your parents. We love you. Don't let them do this to us. Please, I'm begging you." This was it. The final desperate manipulation. The appeal to a love they had proven they didn't feel. The demand for a loyalty they had never shown. Everyone in the room looked at me. My parents, their lawyer, Michael, my grandfather. The entire war had come down to this single moment, this single decision. My grandfather spoke, his voice quiet. "It's your choice, Mary, completely. Do you want to press charges?" I looked at them. Two strangers in designer clothes, their faces streaked with tears of self-pity. I saw the ghost of the little girl who craved their approval. I saw the college student shamed for needing a textbook. I saw the young woman struggling to pay her rent while they drank champagne on a yacht bought with her money. I saw the one-way tickets to Costa Rica. They weren't begging for my forgiveness. They were begging to escape the consequences of their own actions. And I knew with a certainty that resonated in my very bones that I was done protecting them from themselves. I took a deep breath and looked directly at my grandfather. "Yes," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a bomb. My mother let out a wounded cry. My father stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. But I didn't look away. For the first time, I was the one drawing the line, and I was not going to let them cross it. The decision to press charges ignited a firestorm. My quiet personal battle became a public spectacle. My parents, backed into a corner and facing the real possibility of prison, decided their only way out was to destroy me. The lawsuit hit the local news outlets like a bomb, and the headlines were mortifying. Hart family feud. Local philanthropists accused of stealing daughter's $3.4 million trust. Almost immediately, their smear campaign began. It was insidious and cruel. They didn't give interviews themselves. Instead, anonymous sources close to the family began talking to tabloid reporters and gossip columnists. The narrative they painted was one I barely recognized. I was described as a troubled and unstable young woman, prone to flights of fancy and exaggeration. They claimed I had always been distant and difficult, resentful of their success. The most vicious lie was that I was being manipulated by my senile and vindictive grandfather, who was using me to settle an old score with my mother. I remember reading the first article online. I was sitting in my apartment, and the words on the screen made my vision swim. "She has a history of mental instability," the anonymous source claimed. "This entire lawsuit is a tragic fantasy she's constructed." It felt like a physical assault. They weren't just denying their crime. They were trying to erase my sanity, to invalidate my reality. They wanted the world to see me as a crazy, ungrateful liar. For a moment, the old fear crept back in. What if people believed them? I called Michael in a panic, my voice shaking as I read the quotes to him. He was unperturbed. "Let them talk, Mary," he said calmly. "They are handing us ammunition. Slander is the last resort of the desperate. We have something they don't. What's that?" I asked. "The truth," he said, "and a mountain of paperwork to back it up." And he was right. My grandfather's legal team launched a counteroffensive that was brutally efficient and entirely factual. They didn't engage in name-calling or emotional appeals. They simply released documents. To a reputable financial journalist, they provided a redacted copy of the trust's withdrawal statements. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about a troubled daughter anymore. It was about a $1.8 million withdrawal for a property in Malibu. It was about a $280,000 purchase of 2 Teslas. It was about dates and numbers and routing codes, hard, undeniable facts that their vague accusations couldn't touch. The legal process itself was a grueling marathon. There were depositions, long days spent in sterile conference rooms where my parents' lawyer tried to twist my words and paint me as a confused, incompetent child who couldn't possibly understand complex finances. I sat there under the hum of fluorescent lights and calmly answered every question. I told them about the textbook. I told them about the financial literacy book. I told them about the phone calls where they bragged about their vacations. With Michael by my side, coaching me to stick to the facts, I found a strength I never knew I had. My quietness became a weapon. My simple, direct language cut through their legal jargon. The most difficult part was the court-ordered seizure of their assets. As part of the restitution process, marshals went to the house in Marin and began cataloging everything of value. The art, the jewelry, the wine collection. Each item was a piece of my stolen future being reclaimed. I didn't want any of it, but it had to be done to repay the trust. I received a call one day from the auction house, asking if I wanted to keep any personal items, photographs, family heirlooms. I thought about it for a long time, about the pictures of me as a smiling child, unaware of the betrayal already in motion. I told them to sell it all. Those memories weren't real. They were props in a long-running play. The day the judge handed down his final ruling was gray and overcast, the sky matching the mood in the courtroom. It wasn't a dramatic trial with a jury, it was a civil case. and the evidence was so overwhelming that it was decided by a judge in a final hearing. My parents sat at the defendant's table looking like ghosts. Their slick lawyer was gone, replaced by a court-appointed attorney. They had run out of money. The judge read his decision in a dry monotone, but his words were a symphony of vindication. He found them liable for the full amount of the missing funds, plus interest and legal fees. He ordered the immediate sale of the Malibu and Marin properties, with all proceeds to be returned to the trust. He finalized the restitution order, a legally binding document that would require them to pay a percentage of any future income they ever earned until the debt was settled. In the end, because they had been left with nothing and I chose not to pursue the criminal charges to their full extent, they avoided prison. But they were left with a life sentence of debt and public disgrace. They were ruined. They didn't look at me as they were escorted out of the courtroom. I didn't feel a surge of triumph or joy. I just felt a profound sense of exhaustion and a quiet, somber sense of balance. The scales had finally been set right. That evening, I had dinner with my grandfather at his quiet, stately home. He looked older, the fight having taken a toll on him as well. We sat in his library, surrounded by old books and the smell of leather. "You were brave today, Mary," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I was just tired of the lies," I replied. He looked at me, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful wisdom. "Your mother, she was always concerned with appearances, with the decoration of life. She never understood the foundation. Blood makes you related, Mary. Character makes you family," he sighed. I spent years trying to teach her that, trying to fix what was broken in her. But I never could. You did what I never could. You drew a line. His words settled something deep inside me. He wasn't just proud of me for winning a lawsuit. He was proud of me for having the character his own daughter lacked. I hadn't just reclaimed my money. I had reclaimed my family, or at least what was left of it. A family of two, built not on blood, but on a shared understanding of right and wrong. In the weeks that followed the court's decision, the money began to return. It didn't come in a single, glorious check, but in a series of sterile electronic transfers as assets were liquidated. The numbers that appeared in the new bank account Michael had set up for me were so large they seemed abstract, like a phone number or a tracking code. For a while I didn't touch it. I just let it sit there, proof that it was all real. I continued living in my peeling apartment with Madison, working on small freelance projects, my life externally unchanged, but internally, everything was different. The constant, low-grade anxiety about money that had been my companion for my entire adult life was gone. In its place was a quiet sense of security that felt like a foreign language I was slowly learning to speak. My first major decision was to find a new place to live. I wasn't looking for a mansion or a penthouse. I was looking for a sanctuary. I wanted a place that was quiet, a place with light, a place that felt safe. I hired a real estate agent. A kind woman who was initially confused when this young woman in jeans and a t-shirt gave her a budget that could afford some of the nicest properties in the city. We looked at a dozen places. They were all beautiful, but none of them felt right. Then she took me to a building in Pacific Heights, an elegant older building overlooking the bay. The apartment was on the 7th floor. The moment I walked in, I knew. The afternoon sun was streaming through enormous windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The walls were a soft white, the floors a warm, gleaming hardwood. And the view stole my breath. It was a perfect panorama of the bay, with the Golden Gate Bridge standing proud and red in the distance, and Alcatraz a small dark shape on the water. It was a view of possibilities. "I'll take it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The day I got the keys was both terrifying and exhilarating. I walked into the vast empty space, my footsteps echoing on the wood floors. My entire life's possessions would barely fill a single corner of the living room. For a moment, a wave of imposter syndrome washed over me. Did I deserve this? This quiet luxury, this staggering beauty? And then I remembered the courtroom, the depositions, the smear campaign. I hadn't won the lottery. I had fought a war. This apartment wasn't a prize. It was my reparations. This was the peace I had earned. I spent the first few days just being in the space. I bought a comfortable armchair and placed it by the window. I would sit there for hours, watching the fog roll in and burn off, watching the container ships glide silently across the water. The silence of the apartment was a healing balm. It was the opposite of the noisy arguments my parents had, the opposite of the cramped chaos of my old apartment, the opposite of the screaming headlines. It was the sound of my new life. When I finally unpacked, the contrast was almost comical. I placed my handful of worn paperbacks on the custom-built bookshelves that spanned an entire wall. I set my old second-hand laptop on the gleaming marble of the kitchen island. I hung my few items of clothing in a walk-in closet that was bigger than my old bedroom. It wasn't about the stuff. It was about the space. The space to breathe. The space to think. The space to heal. A week after I moved in, Madison came over for the official housewarming. She walked in, her jaw dropping as she took in the view. "Mary," she breathed, "it's a palace." "It's home," I said, feeling the truth of the word for the first time. We didn't have a fancy party. We ordered greasy pizza and cheap Chinese takeout, our old comfort foods. We sat on the floor of the empty living room, because I hadn't bought a sofa yet, and drank cheap wine out of 2 elegant crystal glasses I had bought that afternoon. It was a perfect blend of my old life and my new one, a symbol that the money hadn't changed me, but the journey absolutely had. "So," Madison said, taking a huge bite of pizza, "how does justice taste?" I looked out the window at the city lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled over the bay. A tear traced a path down my cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release. "Like peace," I said, my voice thick with emotion, with a side of exhaustion. We talked for hours, dreaming up a future that was suddenly a blank canvas. Should I travel? Should I go back to school and get a master's degree? Should I start my own design firm, free from the pressure of chasing clients who paid late? The options were limitless. And while it was overwhelming, it was the most wonderful kind of overwhelming. After Madison left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the lights of the bridge glitter against the black water. The apartment was silent again, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was full of promise. I pulled out my phone and sent a simple text to my grandfather. "Thank you for fighting when I couldn't." His reply came back almost instantly. "You always could. You just needed proof, and I knew he was right. The strength had been there all along. It had just been buried under a lifetime of lies." Standing there in my apartment with a view, I finally felt free. Months passed. The city transitioned from the cool fog of summer to the crisp air of autumn. I settled into my new life, creating routines that were grounded in peace rather than survival. I started a small boutique design agency, taking on only the projects that inspired me. I traveled. I took painting classes. I slowly, carefully, began to rebuild the person I was supposed to be before my parents' greed stunted my growth. I heard about them sometimes. Through my grandfather, I learned they had lost everything. They moved into a small rental apartment in Oakland, a world away from the glass mansion in Marin. My father, his reputation in tatters, could only find a low-level consulting job. My mother worked part-time in retail. The restitution payments were automatically deducted from their paychecks each month, a constant, humiliating reminder of their debt. I never felt joy hearing this. There was no pleasure in their downfall. There was only a quiet sense of balance, the feeling of a world set right. They hadn't just stolen money, they had stolen integrity, and now they were living in the poverty of their choices. One evening, I visited my grandfather. He was getting frailer, his movements slower, but his mind was as sharp as ever. We sat in his library, a comfortable silence between us. "You learned something they never did," he said, looking at me over the rim of his glasses. "What's that?" I asked. "That love without integrity is just decoration," he said. "It's a pretty facade on an empty house. You chose the foundation. I'm proud of you for that." That night, on my way home, my route took me past Atelier Crenne. The restaurant was lit up, just as it had been on my birthday. Through the large windows, I could see people in expensive clothes laughing and raising their glasses and toasts under the glittering chandeliers. They were strangers, living out a scene that had once been the site of my life's demolition. I felt a ghost of the panic from that night, a faint echo of the heartbreak. But it was distant, like a storm seen from miles away. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. I had no desire to burn the place down, no need to relive the trauma. The story was over. Some stories don't need a fiery, screaming revenge. They just need closure. And mine ended with the quiet hum of my car's engine as I drove toward my peaceful home, leaving the past behind me in the rearview mirror. My parents stole my future and called it love, but I took it back, quietly, legally, and completely. If you've ever been betrayed by family, know that your truth is the most powerful thing you own. Hit like, share your story in the comments, and subscribe. Because some truths are worth telling,